What we're going to do in this exercise is take a look at the way that Atelier works with UVs and textures on meshes in relation to IMVU. So what we're going to do to make this easy to understand is draw out a shape that is 128 centimeters wide by 16 high. So this corresponds to 128 by 16 pixels in terms of image size. So OK that, have that dropped into the scene, get that positioned. So this is our object, just a simple object. So what we're going to do with this is just add an image. So we've got an image, as mentioned, that corresponds to these dimensions. So 128 by 16 or 256 by 32, 512 by 64. So got our object selected. We want to be in the properties editor, and we're just going to add a texture to this. So we need to select the material, get the material properties up, and then we want texture. So click on the plus button. Just going to add our image. There it is, Scarf United, open. So that's going to add it to our mesh. So the image is being scaled relative to pixels versus centimeters. So ordinarily, to fit the image one-to-one on a mesh, as we would do in Blender, we might go into the UV editor. So for that, we want to be in Tools, UV editor. So if we activate that, this is what we see. This is the UV. It's essentially the pattern, but as a UV. So what we want to do is just click on Layout, and that will automatically position the UV in valid UV space, which is this. So this is our UV texture space that's available. So if we were to export this, so let's do that. If we were to export this and open the file in Blender, we should see a corresponding UV map to this. So with our mesh selected, we're just going to export this. We're not going to do any simulation or 3D. We're just going to export this as is. So File, Export, FBX. UV mapping 1, FBX, that's okay. And just save. We only want the mesh, so we can disable all props, all avatars. Everything else is okay. Thin mesh. This is okay, this is okay, and this is okay. So, okay. Now in Blender, if we import this, so it's a clean scene, so File, Import, FBX, browse to our location. There's our file. These settings are okay. Disable animation. We don't want any armature information, so check to confirm and then just OK. Import FBX. So that's brought in our mesh, and per what we normally have to do, just rescale this up to Blender's correct scaling to also match IMVU. So material preview, and we should see our material. So it has a corresponding mapping that replicates what's in Atelier. So it's being tiled. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and a bit. So in Blender, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and a bit. So if we were to look at the UV map for this, so select our object, UV editing, and there we can see our mesh relative to our object. So it's literally ignored the UV map. So in Style3D, this is our UV map. This is the valid texture space or the UV space that's available. But what it's done is mapped the image relative to the image's size on the object, not the UV map. So that raises the question, how do we change the way that the image tiles or appears on our meshes in Atelier? The way that we do that is by editing the material directly. So if we just go back to the 2D view, we don't need the UV editor anymore. So again, it's tiling along the entire length of the mesh. So make sure our material is selected. And what we want here is texture transformation, width and height. So we are in material properties, texture transformation. So we use texture to assign the image. We're going to use texture transformation to edit its appearance in terms of its scaling on the mesh. And we do that by changing the width. Let's try 128. And that has fit our image perfectly onto our mesh. In this particular instance, because our pattern matches the dimensions of our image. So it's a power of 2 image, 128 by 16 centimeters for the pattern, which corresponds to 128 by 16 pixels for the image. So we can change the scaling. If we go down to 64, that doubles. 32, that quadruples. 16. So long as we have our mesh set to power of 2 to match our image, the 2 will work together in terms of width and height, the texture's transformation information. So let's change this back to 128 by 16 and export this. Select the mesh, File, Export FBX, call this 1B, save. Again, we don't need props, avatars, everything else is okay. Okay. So importing this into Blender. So File, Import, FBX, 1B, Import. That's brought that in. Scale that one up. 1, 1, 1. We should then find our scarf. United texture is mapped 1 to 1. And again, if we go into UV editing, we'll find the UV map and mesh correspond. So in this particular instance, when we're working with IMVU, materials are scaled across our meshes relative to texture scaling in Atelier, not the UV map. So ordinarily we would scale the UV map to change the scaling and position of our texture. So that's just a quick look at the way that Atelier works with image scaling rather than UV data. So if we now do a little bit of simulation on this, the image should stay put. Let's just drop a pin. Simulate. Turn this into a sash. and the image stays put on our object. So if we were to export this, let's just save this file, save as, call this to file, export, FBX. Okay. Don't need that, don't need that. So that's what we've got. Okay. Import this into Blender. File, import, FBX. Okay, import FBX. There's our mesh. Change the scaling. 1, 1, 1. And there is our Sash using UV editor, using the same UV map. So it's kept the positioning of the texture relative to the mesh. So that's just a quick look at the way that Atelier works with texture, scaling, sizing, positioning, rather than UV maps, as we might do in Blender for IMVU. So again, that's in, with our material selected. We're in material properties, and we're changing texture transformation, width and height. So in this case, that's power of 2, just to make this easy to understand. So there we are, quick look at how Atelier works with texture scaling rather than UV maps for texture placement on our meshes.